Montana Territory, August 1879. The river had nearly claimed her by the time he spotted the limp shape, caught on a low-hanging branch near the bend. Conrad Vexley drove his heels into the flanks of his horse, the animal barely slowing as he swung. Down from the saddle in one fluid motion, the current was fierce, biting cold, and relentless. Her body floated face down, skirts twisted in a whirl of mud and reeds. He didn't hesitate. Boots still on, heart pounding, he plunged into the frigid rush. The river slammed against his chest, stole his breath, but his hands found her waist, then her shoulders. She was heavier than she looked, dead weight, soaked through and still as stone. A curse hissed through his teeth as he hauled her free, dragging her up the sloped, muddy bank like a man driven by something primal. "Come on," he gritted, falling to his knees beside her. He turned her over, and for a moment, everything else vanished. Her skin was ghost pale, lips tinged blue, long dark lashes stuck to her cheeks, which were streaked with silt. "No, no. You breathe," he whispered fiercely. "You hear me?" He pressed both palms to her chest and pushed, hard and fast, again and again. Water gurgled from her mouth, then suddenly a choking gasp. Her body seized as air rushed in. She began to cough violently, spasmodically. Conrad caught her as she curled inward, trembling from the shock of returning life. He pulled her to him, cradling her against his chest as her eyes fluttered open in dazed pain and recognition. "I didn't ride to days to bury you," he said, voice low and raw. "You're not dying here. Not like this," she rasped. Her voice was barely a breath. Conrad, his heart stopped. "Zaid," her fingers fisted weakly in the front of his shirt as she stared up at him, like a specter had come to claim her. "It's really you." For a long moment, he couldn't speak. He just looked at her, thinner now, older. Her face shadowed with bruises and hardship, but still Zaidai Allender, the girl he had once vowed to marry before pride, war, and miles of silence tore their fates apart. Wordlessly, he gathered her in his arms and carried her to where his saddlebags lay. His horse paced a few feet away, agitated by the river's rush. Conrad laid her gently on the ground, pulling a dry blanket from his gear and wrapping it around her shivering frame. "I thought you were dead," he finally said. "Last I heard, you married a man in Helena." He added, barely able to look at her, "I never married." She whispered, "He left, took everything, left me with the children." Conrad froze. "Children?" Zaidai nodded slowly, tears rising, but not yet falling. "Gabrielle and Grace. They're 5. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "He left 3 months ago. We had nothing, no food. I tried to get work, but no one would hire a woman with 2 little ones. I was trying to get them to my sister. We were crossing the river." Her voice faltered. "It was too fast. I lost hold of the raft. They're still out there." Conrad was already on his feet. "Where?" "An old barn, about a mile back across the ridge," she said. But he was moving before she could finish, shouldering his rifle and tightening the saddle. "Stay warm," he said. "I'll bring them. You can't go alone." She struggled to rise, but her body betrayed her, nearly dropping her again. He turned back, voice hard with resolve. "Zaidai, listen to me. I will get them. You just keep breathing." She watched him vanish into the pines, her chest aching with more than cold. The last time she'd seen Conrad Vexley was in 1871. He had kissed her goodbye and promised to return once he'd saved enough to build them a life. But the letters had stopped after a year. She had believed he'd forgotten her. She had tried to forget him too. She had failed. And now, just when everything seemed lost, he had come back. Nearly an hour later, dusk draped the land in blue shadows. When Conrad returned, his shirt dark with sweat, breath ragged, in each arm he carried a child. Gabrielle stared at her wide-eyed. Grace clung to his neck, face buried in his shoulder. "Mama." Gabrielle scrambled down the moment Conrad set him on the ground and ran to her. Zaidai opened her arms, tears pouring freely now. She held them both, their small bodies anchoring her to the earth. "You're safe," she whispered, rocking them gently. "You're safe." Conrad stood a few feet back, watching the reunion in silence. "You found them?" she asked, eyes shining with disbelief. "I said I would." She looked at him with something soft and old in her gaze. Thank you. He crouched beside her, brushing damp hair from her face. There's a cabin a few hours north. Belongs to an old friend. You need rest. We can't stay long. I have nothing left, she whispered. You have me, he said quietly, so simply that her breath caught. She looked at him, really looked. His jaw rough with stubble, his shirt torn at the shoulder. He looked older, worn. But those same green eyes, they hadn't changed. You came for me, she said, voice trembling. I never stopped wanting to. She reached for his hand. He took it, no hesitation. They rode through the night. Zadai nestled in front of him on the saddle. The children bundled against his back. He whispered to her sometimes. Fragments of promises once made, long ago, but never broken in his heart. By the time they reached the cabin, dawn had begun to seep into the sky, casting everything in soft gray. He helped her down gently, carried the sleeping children inside, and tucked them into warm furs by the hearth. Then he lit a fire, set a lantern on the table, and turned to her. I know this isn't how things were meant to be, he said. But you're here, and I'm here. She stepped toward him, eyes wet with something deeper than tears. You saved me, Conrad. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek. You're all I ever wanted. She leaned into his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her like she was something fragile and sacred. He'd almost lost for good. I'm never letting you go again, he whispered into her hair. Her eyes closed. Then don't. The cabin sat still beneath the pines, smoke curling gently from the chimney. The inside was warm with firelight, the scent of ash and pine sap thick in the air. Zadai sat by the hearth on a woven stool, Conrad's wool shirt hanging loose on her frame. Sleeves rolled high, her wet clothes hung on a line above her. The children slept soundly under spare pelts in the corner, cheeks pink from the cold. You eat? Conrad asked as he stepped back inside. His boots were damp from the dew. A canvas sack hung over one shoulder. He kept his voice low so as not to wake the little ones. Some, she murmured without looking up. The bread was hard, but good. He placed the sack on the table, pulling out a tin of dried apples and a chunk of cheese. I'll ride to the trading post tomorrow, he said. Get some flour. Beans, maybe salt pork if the price ain't too steep. She nodded, fingers twisted in her lap. You don't have to do all that. He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. I'm not doing it out of pity. She took the cup, hands trembling faintly. You always did take on more than was yours to carry. Conrad leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Don't see it that way. She looked over at him, firelight gilding one side of her face. You could have kept writing. I could have, he said simply, but I didn't. They sat in the hush. Only the crackle of the fire and Gabriel's slow breathing filling the room. Outside, something rustled near the trees, a squirrel or bird, maybe. The world felt paused, suspended in waiting. I didn't know where you'd gone, she said at last. When the letters stopped, I thought maybe you'd joined up again, or married. I was working cattle down near Abilene, he replied. Got jumped driving a herd, took a shot through the side. Took 6 months before I could stand proper again. By the time I could write, I figured you'd already moved on. She drew her knees close, holding the warm cup. I nearly did. Tried to convince myself it was better that way. He pulled a chair beside her, but it wasn't. She met his eyes. No, it wasn't. For a long time, they just sat. Grace stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft sigh. Zadai glanced at her, and a faint smile tugged her lips. Gabriel's. Got your eyes, Conrad said. Zadai blinked. What makes you say that? They're wide like yours. See everything, don't miss a thing. She looked down. He asks questions I can't always answer. Why his father left. Why we lost our house. Why I cry sometimes when I think I'm alone. You don't have to answer all of them, Conrad said. You just have to be there. Her voice was bare now. I didn't expect to raise them alone. I kept thinking if I just worked harder, stopped complaining, it would get better. You didn't fail them, he said. You did what you could with what you had. She looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but clear. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. Then we start slow. They sat in silence again, not the kind that choked, but the kind that made room. Later, she rose to check on the children. tucking the blanket tighter around Gabriel's small feet. Conrad watched the way her hands moved, gentle, practiced. When she turned back, her voice had softened. I can help at the post. Clean, mend things. I won't just take from you. You're not, he said. You're here. That's enough. She didn't argue. But she didn't agree either. She simply crossed to the table and began cutting the cheese into neat squares, laying them carefully on a tin plate. The simple motion, so steady and quiet, seemed to stitch something back together. Conrad took the plate from her hands and set it by the fire for when the children woke. You can stay as long as you need. No one's coming for this place. Whose was it? She asked. Grady Finch. Died 3 winters ago. No kin. Used to say the trees made better company than people. Zadai gave a small smile. I understand that more than I used to. He didn't reply, just pulled the blanket from the drying line and draped it around her shoulders. She didn't flinch. I'll fetch more wood, he murmured. You warm them up when they wake. She nodded. I will. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Zadie stood there a long moment, the blanket heavy and warm around her. She looked at the fire, then at the children, then at the door, and for the first time in many months, her shoulders eased not in surrender, but in rest. The morning passed with the hush of a place long forgotten by roads. Conrad chopped wood. Behind the cabin, shirt damp with sweat, Zadai boiled water inside, rinsed the children's spare clothing in a creek-fed bucket. Gabriel helped her rinse, his little hands awkward but determined. Grace sat nearby, threading pine needles onto a string with quiet focus. By midday, the sun warmed the clearing. Conrad brought in a hunch of venison wrapped in oilcloth, traded 2 days earlier from a trapper. He laid it on the table. Zadai, sleeves still rolled high, was wringing out a pair of stockings. You ever dress game? He asked, pulling a knife from his belt. Once, she said, brushing hair from her damp brow. But it came wrapped in brown paper, cost more than I had to spare. He nodded, slicing the meat clean. We'll stew it with the last of the carrots. That'll carry us through. She stepped beside him, eyes on the blade. You always this well supplied? Only when I plan ahead. Most winters I don't. How long you been alone? He trimmed the fat, setting it aside. Since Grady passed. Before that, I was drifting, cattle drives, fence work, whatever paid clean. You ever think of settling? She asked, stirring the pot now warming on the fire. Not until now. She stilled, looked toward the window where the pines moved gently in the light. That night, after supper was eaten, and the children curled beneath Conrad's spare coat, Zadai stepped out onto the porch. The moon rode pale above the pines, the air heavy with damp soil and resin. She wrapped the shawl tighter, leaned against the post. You can see the whole ridge from here, she said softly as Conrad joined her. He nodded, arms loose across his chest. Hawk nests up there come spring. You'll hear them before you see them. Asterisk. She turned her gaze toward the slope, her expression unreadable in the dim hush of twilight. You remember the first time we talked about leaving Montana? Beside your father's barn? He nodded. You were holding a basket of eggs, he said, and I was bleeding from the jaw. She laughed, the sound soft, caught off guard by the memory. That's right. You'd fought Levy Baines over that bay mare he claimed you'd stolen. Her voice held a flicker of fondness and disbelief. He said if I so much as looked your way again, he'd finish what he started. She turned to face him, the night brushing silver along her cheekbones. You didn't listen. No, he said quietly. I didn't. The trees swayed gently with the wind, and somewhere distant, an owl called, low and rhythmic. Still, neither of them moved. Conrad, she said at last, her voice low and careful. I don't know what you think this is. I'm here, but I can't promise anything, not yet. I'm not asking you to, he replied. I'm just asking you to stay. She looked at him then, really looked, as though trying to read. Something in his face she wasn't sure could be found. You still wear that same look, she murmured. When something matters to you. He held her gaze. And this matters. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her fingers lifted, brushing the edge of his jaw where stubble had darkened in rough lines. I didn't think I'd feel anything again, she whispered. You don't have to call it anything. He said, just let it be. She stepped Closer, her hands still resting against his face. I was drowning long before that river took me. I'll keep pulling you out, he said, for as long as it takes. He took her hand then, not like a promise, but like an anchor, and she didn't pull away. Inside, the fire had faded to a hush of glowing embers. Gabriel stirred once in sleep and nestled closer to his sister. Outside, the wind slipped between the trees like fingers through hair, and the old porch creaked beneath their feet, but they didn't shift. Zadie leaned her head against Conrad's shoulder, and he lowered his chin gently onto her hair. Neither spoke. They stayed like that until the moon disappeared behind the ridge and the land began to change. September's touch colored the hills in warmer hues. The mornings edged with frost, and the evenings filled with winds scented like hay and pine dust. The cabin found its rhythm, slow, deliberate, and steady. Zadie mended clothes and curtains. Conrad hauled timber and water. Gabriel trailed behind Conrad's every movement like a shadow, and Grace took to whispering elaborate stories to the trees behind the chicken coop they'd built from salvaged planks. One Thursday, Zadie returned from the neighbor's place, balancing a pail of milk. Holstein, the old cow owned by Mrs. Yates, a widow living half a mile down the trail, had been generous that morning. Conrad was near the ridge, splitting fence rails. His sleeves rolled high, arms moving smooth and sure with every swing of the axe. Mrs. Yates said her son's coming back from Missoula, Zadie said, setting the pail beside his boots. She asked if we'd help clear brush from her northern field before the snow settles in. Conrad leaned on the axe handle, catching his breath. You think she'll let me use that plow she keeps under the lean-to? She might, Zadie replied. She said you've got a straightforward manner. He let out a quiet laugh, wiping his brow. That's one way of saying it. She stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing the brittle grass. You think the soil near the creek's worth turning? I saw some dark earth there. Might grow something. Potatoes, maybe, he said, if the deer don't eat them. First she glanced toward the lower slope where the pines gave way to open land warmed by the sun. I've never planted anything of my own, she said, always used borrowed ground. He studied her then, the way her chin held firm even as her eyes carried a familiar uncertainty. You're not borrowing anymore, he told her. This place has room. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she crouched near the pail of milk, dipped a finger into the dust, and traced a slow circle. This morning, Gabriel asked what your last name was, she said. I told him it was Vexley. He said it sounded like something out of a tall tale. Conrad set his axe aside and leaned on a fence post he'd just driven. He's not wrong, he said. He also asked if you're going to stay forever. Her voice faltered, hesitant. What did you tell him? I said you built the chicken coop, she said quietly. And you don't do that if you're planning on riding off. The wind stirred the trees again, slow, dry, thoughtful. Conrad stepped forward, close now, close enough that she could see the faint scar running along the side of his temple, one that hadn't been there 8 years ago. I'm not going anywhere, Zadie, he said. But I won't fill their heads with promises unless you want me to. She stood, her shawl catching in the wind. They already look for you every morning, she said. They eat more when you're at the table. He brushed his hand against the back of hers. She started, but her voice caught. I sleep now. He took her wrist gently, not to pull, just to hold. What are you afraid of? He asked. That it won't last, she said. That this quiet, this peace, is just the eye of the storm. I know storms, he said. This isn't one. She slipped her hand into his, their fingers lacing without hesitation. They stood by the unfinished fence as the light poured gold across the ridge, cedar heavy in the air. Later that night, once the children were asleep, bellies full, feet warm, Zadie stood at the wash basin, drying her hands on a linen cloth. Conrad sat at the table nearby, counting coins and scribbling notes on a scrap of paper. I've been thinking, she said. He looked up. If we put in a root cellar before frost, we could keep more than turnips, she said. Maybe store some salt meat from town. You planning to dig it yourself? He asked with a raised brow. No, she smiled. But I'll help. I know you will. You don't sit idle. She leaned against the table, her hip brushing the wood. I want this to work, Conrad, she said. I'm still learning how to say that without flinching. He set the pencil down. You just did. She reached for his face, brushing her thumb along his cheekbone. You make it feel possible. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It is. She bent toward him and kissed him slow, no rush, no fear, just sure. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. The silence between them was warm outside. The wind had picked up, sending dry leaves dancing across the porch. Inside, the fire was low, the night deepening around them, and for the first time in years, they weren't waiting for something to break. They were building something that would hold. By mid-October, the ridge trees blazed copper and wine. Frost came heavy before dawn, lacing the roof and creeping over the green tips of the last carrots by the creek. The root cellar was finished, deep, stone-lined, and braced with timber from an old line shack Conrad had salvaged 3 miles. North, Zadie packed it with jars from Mrs. Yates, pickled beets, stewed apples, salt beans bartered for mending and firewood. One gray afternoon, the scent of snow close on the wind, Zadie and Conrad stood on the porch, watching Gabriel and Grace gather pine cones into their aprons. I wrote to my brother in Bozeman, she said, arms wrapped against the chill. He wrote back last week, said he thought I was gone, too. Conrad glanced at her. Did he offer anything, a spot in his barn? He said if I'd found a better man than the last, I ought to stay put. Conrad looked back toward the field. Then he's got good sense. She reached for his hand. I told him we were all right here. He opened his palm and threaded their fingers together. You believe that? I do, inside. The kettle hissed gently on the stove. Grace called out for her dropped ribbon, and Gabriel shushed her with the same seriousness Conrad used when splitting wood. Zadie stepped into the yard, picked up the ribbon, and tucked it into Grace's hand. The little girl beamed and ran back toward her brother. They sleep better now, Zadie said as she returned to Conrad. They don't ask for things I can't give. You give them more than you know, he said, brushing her wrist softly. That night, after the children had settled and the fire burned low, Conrad pulled down a cedar box from the shelf. He opened it carefully, lifting out a folded piece of blue calico. I bought this in Helena years ago, he said. Meant to give it to you. Thought I'd never get the chance. She unfolded the cloth slowly. The fabric was fine, patterned with tiny white blossoms. I'd forgotten this shade. She said softly, I wore something like it the day you left, I remember. She held the cloth to her chest and met his eyes. I never thought I'd want to wear something pretty again. You don't have to dress up for me. I know, she said. This time, her smile reached all the way through her. But I want to. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. You're home now, Zadie. She kissed him slow, her hands at his collar, his arms pulling her close. It wasn't rushed. It was steady, certain. A love returned, not with fire, but with warmth built brick by brick. The next morning, Conrad hitched the wagon and rode into town with Gabriel beside him, wrapped in wool and full of questions about wheels, reins, and the distance to the trading post. Zadie stayed behind with Grace, who helped hang linens while birds flickered between trees. By the time Conrad returned, the sun was slipping behind the ridge. He handed her a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Inside were new boots for Gabriel, molasses for Grace, and a square of chocolate wrapped in wax cloth. I figured it was time you had something sweet, he said, brushing dirt from his sleeve. She looked up at him, her eyes soft with something unspoken. I already do. They ate supper by lamplight. Afterward, Conrad carried Grace to bed while Zadie braided Gabriel's hair the way he liked it, neat and tangled free. Outside, snow began to fall, slow and soft, catching on the eaves, dusting the porch and fence. Later, wrapped together in the narrow bed they now shared, Zadie rested her head on Conrad's chest. What will we do when spring comes? She asked. Plant, he said. Fence the south slope, maybe raise chicks, if we can keep the foxes out. And after that, he turned his face toward hers. Whatever you want. We've got time. She traced a line across his collarbone. I want to stay right here with you. His hands slid up her back, firm and sure. Then that's what we'll do. The The snow thickened through the night, quieting the world beyond their walls. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady, and the silence was no longer lonely. It was full of breath, of warmth, of small dreams stretching slowly into real ones. Winter passed, the cellar stayed full, the children grew. Gabriel learned to tie knots. Grace named each hen. The garden took root that spring. The potatoes came up thick and stubborn. Zadai learned to quilt with scraps traded from Mrs. Yates. And Conrad built a second room onto the cabin with boards hauled by wagon. On a bright April morning, as the creek rushed with meltwater and the air smelled of grass just born, they stood together on the porch, watching the children chase each other past the fence. Zadai's hand rested on her belly. Conrad's covered hers. He kissed her temple. "I never thought I'd have this." "You do now," she said. And he did. A quiet life, hard-earned and full. A home made not from what they'd inherited, but from what they chose, each day. Each post-driven, each supper shared, each night side by side as the wind moved gently through the trees and the world turned steady and sure around them.